Okay, so 18th, 17th century economy and society, unit 5.1. So this video's intent is to introduce the agricultural revolution and review things we've talked about, but in the context of the 18th century, so we can then set ourselves up for the industrial revolution, which we're going to start with when we return from break. So hopefully you have read chapter 14 in Merriman. This lecture will also kind of give the cause and effect. So AP Euro loves cause and effect and kind of some turning points. So really the only new thing you'll be introduced to is the agricultural revolution, a little bit more of that putting out system that we talked about in England, and then some review of things in a little bit more chronological, like the things that we've learned and how they have to do with the 18th century and what it's setting us up for. So we've seen the scientific revolution, we've seen the French Revolution, the American Revolution. We're going to start with our next revolution, which is the agricultural revolution, which will set the stage really nicely for us with the Industrial Revolution when we return. I'm going to go fairly quickly through Unit 5.1. A, it's things that you've heard about before, even if we haven't discussed them, like the Agricultural Revolution. B, I have typed up pretty much everything word for word in this note packet, so you shouldn't have to stop to write much. Maybe underline, highlight, add a few side notes if you wish to, but meant to keep this, save your break time, make sure that you're prepped for the Industrial Revolution so we don't have to slow down when we get back. Okay, so let's set the stage really quickly, what it was like before the 17th and 18th century as regards to agriculture. So the state of agriculture in 1700, our peasants and artisans had about the same standard of living as in the Middle Ages. We haven't seen a lot of change there. They're still broke, they're still poor. Most people are battling hunger and lack sufficient clothing and decent housing. They're going to eat things like dandelions, bark, and grass. Those are considered famine foods. And so we're going to see us eating some pretty strange things, a lack of enough production of food to sustain the population. Even being said, our population is very much lower because of Black Death, and so still not enough agriculture, so we're going to have to see that change. And that's because agricultural technology had changed little since the Middle Ages. They were able to produce a few bushels of food per acre. And so when we have talked about the population before, we've kind of gleamed over the fact that, like 80% of people were farmers, and that is because 80% of Western Europe's population had to be farmers. If you're able to produce so little food to sustain a population, you were going to have lots and lots of people dedicated to agriculture. And that percentage was even higher in Eastern Europe. We're going to see the only exception here is going to be the Netherlands or the lowlands, which we talked about before in the 17th century, are going to have their golden age. And so we'll talk about how they are the exception here. All right, so here you can see the Netherlands was the only exception. They were more urban and mercantile. They have had this commercial, kind of revolution that we talked about. Lots of shipping, lots of trading, lots of boats. They have fewer farmers than the rest of Europe, but they have more food. They're really going to lead the way in the agricultural revolution with England right behind them. And so we're going to kind of follow here in a little bit the lowlands and England as they move ahead of the rest of Europe as it has to do with the agricultural revolution and then the industrial revolution. So before we can get into those new technologies of the lowlands in England, we need to continue with the technology that was had prior 1700, or really the lack thereof. Agricultural output was very low compared to modern standards. The medieval open field system was predominant, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Failed harvest occurred once or twice a decade on average, resulting in famines. Remember, we talked about that mini ice age. These things were very detrimental. If you were already having trouble producing food and then you had these droughts or little mini ice ages, people were malnourished, making them more susceptible to disease and also intestinal ailments. So we've seen, the Black Death and things along that nature, and smallpox and all of these things. That if you don't have enough food in your system, you're more susceptible to that. And at this time, science was essentially a branch of theology and had no real application in agriculture. Now, we saw that change in the scientific revolution, and so we're going to see as we move now into the 18th century when we start to combine that scientific knowledge with agriculture and the agricultural revolution that we'll start to see. But prior to this time, science had been just a branch of the church, as we know. So kind of backing up a little bit so we can do a comparison. So the open field system that I was talking about that was predominant is a medieval system. This is that practice of common lands, so lands available to everyone were open, no fences, because if you had this plow like down in the corner of this slide, you wouldn't want to have to stop the animal to turn at a fence. So open land and strips of land for agriculture had no division by fences or hedges. They were farmed as a community. The land, however, even though like everyone's farming on it, was technically owned by our lords and gentry, which we're going to talk about, especially in England, here in a little bit. Agriculture in villages changed little from generation to generation and was based largely on community and family traditions. So very much family tied. Everyone worked the farm together. And our number one problem with the open field system is exhaustion of soil was a common problem. You know that if you plant things over and over again, that the nutrients in the soil are gone, and then you're producing even less and less food. So you see up here that you have field 2 is barley, field 1 is wheat, field 3 is fallow, where animals are allowed to graze. And so we're going to see that there's this development because of the soil exhaustion to leaving 1/3 or 1/2 of the fields barren or fallow to let livestock feed on is part of our early technology in the Middle Ages so that soil could recover. It's called a rotation process. The problem in this technology, or medieval technology, is that we're already not producing enough food. So now you have 1/3 to 1/2 of your land sitting here with nothing on it, allowing it to recover. And so this won't really solve any problem except for the land isn't completely stripped of nutrients when you do go to plant on it, but we're not getting any more agricultural production here. Villages maintained open meadows for hay and natural pasture. Peasants were often taxed heavily, as we've talked about, and as always, the serfs in Eastern Europe were far worse off than farmers in Western Europe. But things are going to start to change, and so this is where we're kicking in. So there's our backstory, there's our comparison. Now in the 18th century, England and the Netherlands, or the lowlands, and France are going to become the leaders for increased agriculture, industry, and trade that is going to result in population growth. And what is really going to happen is just the elimination of this fallow. That is going to be the first driving force that is going to lead to all of these changes in the agricultural revolution. So that elimination of the fallow is going to give us the features of the agricultural revolution. One will be increased production of food because you have increased crop and animal yields that can feed more people because you don't have 1/3 of the land fallow. There'll be new methods of cultivation. Crops are going to be grown on wasteland and uncultivated common land, so they're going to gain, with this loss of the fallow, they're going to gain more land to plant on. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then out of that will come selective breeding of livestock, which will lead to better cultivation as a result of healthier animals. So this becomes science plus agriculture. Science and technology will be applied to agriculture, so our scientific revolution will prompt our agricultural revolution, with our Low Countries here leading the way. So the Low Countries being the Netherlands, the Dutch people. Increased population in these Low Countries because of their wealth meant that finding new methods of agriculture became paramount. They have been in mercantilism, into shipping, into commercialism. They have really led the way, the golden age of the Netherlands. And so this growth of towns and cities created major markets for food production in the countryside. And regional specialization in the Netherlands is going to result. Certain areas for farming, certain regions for fishing and shipping, towns and cities for mercantile activities. And so all of this is going to prompt the Netherlands or the Dutch to try to find unique and new ways to increase their yield, to increase their food production. So by the mid-17th century, the Dutch are going to begin enclosing fields, rotating crops, and employing the heavy use of manure for fertilizer, and plant a wide variety of crops. The free and capitalistic society is going to provide profit incentives for farmers to be productive. So it's really going for the lowlands that lets them, I guess, lead the way, is that they have this, hands-off, laissez-faire kind of attitude with capitalism, where people can invest this money in new technologies in order to make money off new farming technologies. And so this capitalistic society provides for entrepreneurs, investors, to create this new technology that will allow the lowlands to cover the way. And the really first step in this, because of the lowlands, we know are below sea level, you can see on the map there, is going to be to drain water off of lands to increase the production of food by using this land to plant. So much of Holland had once been marshland or covered by ocean waters. The Dutch are going to become world leaders in reclaiming wetlands through the use of drainage by taking, as you can see this picture here, by taking the water off the land so it can be used for farming. If you know anything about land that water's been sitting on for a long time, the soil underneath it is very fertile, very rich because of the nutrients left behind by the water. So our leader here is going to be a gentleman by the name of Cornelius Vermuyden. He was the most famous of the Dutch engineers in drainage techniques. His drainage techniques will then later be used extensively in southern England to create new farmlands, and so the lowlands will lead with England right behind. They will adapt this technology, also increasing, being an island, very important to use every piece of land that you have. It will reclaim 40,000 acres of Finland to create some of the best agricultural land in England, so very important to the lowlands and to England, as we'll see, very important coming up into the Industrial Revolution. And then here is the Vermuyden family motto, nothing without work. So I think that applies really great to an entrepreneur who came out and is going to kind of lead the way in agricultural production. So speaking of England, by 1870 crop yields had tripled since 1700 with only a 14% increase in people working the land. So this is part and due to the extra land that is now able to be farmed due to the drainage techniques. But then also we'll have a gentleman by the name of Charles Townshend who is going to pioneer crop rotation. So another step in the elimination of the fallow. He was an English ambassador to the Netherlands, and he witnessed the Dutch use of nitrogen-rich crops such as turnips and clover to replenish soil so that fallowing was not necessary. And we'll talk about this more in just a second. He will get the name Turnip Townshend from this use of the very nitrogen-rich crop turnips. He will later drain much land back at home in England. So he's an ambassador. He sees everything that's going on in the lowlands. He's going to bring it to England, but more importantly, he is going to employ what is known as crop rotation rather than leaving 1/3 or 1/2 of the land fallow. And he's going to use nitrogen-rich plants called turnips, peas, beans, clover, and potatoes. I don't know that he knew so much like why it worked other than he just experimented. He used a scientific method to experiment like, oh, these crops leave the soil more nutrient-rich than before they were planted. And so he gets his nickname Turnip Townshend for all of the turnips that he's going to plant. And so let's take a look at this field system. Okay, so what Townshend would do is like you see there's the 4 fields here, one with wheat, the second field with barley, the third with turnips, the fourth with clover. And so no field is left fallow, everything is producing. Now with turnips and clover, you're like, what would you really do with those? Those are going to go to provide more food for livestock, but also to keep the nutrients in the land. So at first, it's not all just food for humans, but this enriched soil provides more food for livestock for fodder. It allows them to produce more manure for fertilizer, which is going to then increase agricultural yield even more. And the increased food for livestock is also going to mean that mass slaughter of animals was no longer needed prior to the winter. So since there is more food to feed the livestock, you don't have to worry about slaughtering all these animals. You can keep them for work. You can slaughter them as needed. Animal feed was now available to sustain livestock through the winter. And people are going to be able to eat more fresh meat rather than preserving surplus meat through salting. And so it's not like, we have to kill it, we can't feed these animals through the winter. We can maintain a steady process of livestock slaughtering rather than all at once. And also the use of manure, as we talked about, going to be very important in the agricultural revolution. By 1740, these new agricultural techniques had become popular among much of the English aristocracy, and there is a lot more food. Townshend is going to inspire others to invest their money to become entrepreneurs, to become mercantilist capitalists, or become capitalists and laissez-faire and want to invest their money in improving agriculture. And so we're going to see that as an example of the scientific revolution and capitalism being applied to agriculture. And so a great example of how the empiricism of the scientific revolution was applied to agriculture would actually be Jethro Tull, who took his lead from Townshend. He was studying to be a lawyer but came upon some bad health, and so he decides, he has all of this land that he wants to then become a farmer, but he's too sick to do all of the work. So he hires all of these people, but then he's like, I don't think they're doing as good of a job as I would do. And so he develops a tool or a piece of technology called the seed drill, and it allowed for the sowing of crops in a straight row rather than scattering it by hand. And so rather than have all of these people working to plant the seeds, and also it's just scattering so you can never tell what's planted anywhere, he develops the seed drill, which allows us, now you drive down the interstate on I-70 and you see all of these crops planted in nice straight rows. That happens because of the seed drill, but it takes a lot of the labor out. And he was able to use horses for plowing rather than slower oxen, so fields are getting planted more quickly. They're putting a determined amount of seed in each spot. It drills down a certain length and a certain amount of seed is dropped in each hole. And so a perfect example of empiricism of the scientific revolution, experimentation and technology being applied to agriculture. Next, Robert Bakewell is going to pioneer selective breeding of livestock. Before, it just been random breeding. Like, you had all these fields out, or all of these animals out in the field, and they just breed with whichever animal they came across during that time. But Bakewell's going to say no. To get fatty sheep, to get stronger work animals, you need to breed the strong work animal with the strong work animal, or the fatty sheep with the fatty sheep, so that you can create stronger work animals or fattier eating animals. And so this then will produce larger and healthier animals during this time, resulting in increased availability of meat, wool, leather, soap, and candle tallow. And more manure will become available for fertilizing. So it starts that process of, if you want this big fat cow to breed with this big fat cow, so they have big fat cows, that's what starts to happen. And so then this has a huge impact as well on agriculture. So here's where we're going to start some of the review of the things we've already talked about, but now we're going to talk about them in the sense that they apply to the 18th century, that they apply to the agricultural revolution, that they apply to our upcoming industrial revolution. So new foods have also been introduced through the Columbian Exchange that resulted in a revolution in diet. New foods from the New World that we talked about in our exploration unit became increasingly available in the 17th and 18th centuries. Potato and corn were among the most important because they were highly nutritious and relatively easy to grow and become part of the agricultural revolution. There's that chart that you had in your notes as we spoke about it in the Columbian Exchange, that what came from the New World to Europe and what came from Europe to the New World. Also, the enclosure movements. This is a review. So we talked about E for enclosure, E for England. That's how you kind of should remember where it starts. It had begun in the 16th century as we started to talk about those lands being enclosed in England, and has slowly been growing as landowners sought to increase their profits from wool production by enclosing fields for raising sheep. So basically, we had talked about before that they'd started to close things off with hedges, and as wool became more important, which is going to become even more important, that the rich gentry started to close off these common lands from the peasants, from the commoners. It differed from the 18th century enclosure, our early enclosure movement, that it was based largely on agriculture. We're going to start to see as we get into the 18th century that it's going to be intensified. It's going to give an end to the open field system, which was one of the medieval technologies that we talked about, that it actually kind of slowed down agricultural production. Landowners in the 18th century are going to start to consolidate their scattered holdings into compact fields that were fenced, and common pasture lands will also be enclosed. So good for you if you're gentry, or if you were, nobility. If you were upper class, you're closing in and solidifying your wealth. Not good for you if you were a peasant or commoner who was really supported by being able to use this common land to farm, to hunt. It resulted in the commercialization of agriculture. It allows risk. If you had all this common land and you were experimenting on it, you could hurt everyone because everyone was reliant on it for food. But if it's just your land, you can experiment like Townsend did and like Bakewell did, and it would only hurt you. So large landowners prospered in investing in technology, machinery, breeding, cultivation methods, increased number of large and middle-sized farms. Parliament is going to pass over 3,000 enclosure acts in the late 18th century and early 19th century that benefit large landowners. This is the ruling elites. They benefit from the higher yields and enclosures And Parliament, we know, is occupied by the gentry and upper ruling elite, are going to start to pass these laws that benefit only these upper ruling elite. And part of these laws will be what is known as the Corn Laws in 1815 that benefit landowners. There are high tariffs placed on foreign grain. It drives up the price of English grain in England because of these tariffs. And who does it hurt? It hurts the poor, as they couldn't afford the price increases for food. One of the most notorious examples of a law that benefited the wealthy at the expense of the English peasantry is the Corn Law. And we are going to talk about this as we move forward into the 18th and 19th century after winter break. These laws directly aid the ruling elite but negatively impact the peasantry. So what is that negative impact on the peasantry? Many were forced off lands that had once been common and that they were dependent on. Many are now going to have to move to towns or cities looking for work since there was less work available in the countryside. This is going to be our growth of cities that is coming up, which is going to allow for our factories and industrial revolution. Many will become impoverished farm laborers or tenant farmers, and in some cases, enclosure freedmen allowed freedmen to pursue other economic opportunities such as the cottage industry. So we're going to see that enclosure will lead to some of these men in the countryside starting to work in the cottage industry, which will then become which is the putting out system, which will then become the factory system. So all this leading up to the Industrial Revolution. And women now had no way to raise animals on common lands for extra money. So we're going to follow the plight of women because of the enclosure movement. And it's going to really change our traditional communities where women have been more of an indispensable part of lower income households' economic survival. Women had really been responsible for farming, raising animals, and overseeing important functions of the household, but the enclosure of common lands meant that women and men were forced off the land. And then not really having any other economic opportunities, women are going to see a decrease in their status significantly. Many families with daughters were eager to get them out of the house as they were an extra mouth to feed. Young women then are going to increasingly go to towns or cities where they become domestic workers, which we're going to talk about in our 18th, 19th century discussion. Or in many cases, when there were no alternatives, we will see the growth of prostitution. Young women will also, as we're going to see, become a portion of our cottage system, our putting out system, where we'll talk about spinning here in a little bit. Families who were able to get by in the countryside are often going to start to supplement their income through this cottage industry or putting out system, mostly for spinning or weaving. And that is the segment we'll talk about here with women's role in spinning and weaving, but also kind of a cultural effect that it has on women here. And that's up next, building up to the Industrial Revolution. But what also happens is we're going to start to see a strict hierarchical system emerge. A few landowners or gentry are going to begin to dominate economy and politics, especially in England. There will be a strong and prosperous tenant farmers who rent land from the large landowners. If you think about it as top down, 1 gentry, 2 prosperous tenant farmers, 3 small peasant farmers who own their own land, and then 4 at the bottom, a huge number of peasants become wage earners on farms or in the cottage industry. As a result of this, there are going to be struggles between landowners and peasants. Game laws will also be passed on behalf of landowners, whereby any animals on owners' vast lands could not be hunted for food. So whereas if you were a commoner before, you could have just hunted deer on any land, now you can be actually punished for doing so, and these landowners will put out these horrific traps and snares to catch people poaching on their land. And peasants who were without food would risk severe punishment if they were caught hunting for food on an owner's land. So we're going to see a lot of really harsh punishments put on the peasantry who are still dependent on the food there, and so they'll risk, their life and limb to still hunt on these lands. There is a historical debate, however, on the impact of the enclosure movement. There's a traditional view where they're like, oh, this was really bad for the peasantry. Enclosures pushed thousands of of peasants out in the countryside, or resulted in abject poverty for those who remained. This was a theory that was really put forth by the socialist Karl Marx in the 19th century, which we're coming up on very quickly, that it made all of these people have to live in poverty, and it increased poverty, and it started this cycle of poverty. But in more recent research, it's been found that the negative effects of enclosure have been highly exaggerated, that there was already all of this enclosure going on since the 16th century, but yet many thousands remained in the countryside working as prosperous tenant farmers, small landowners, or wage earners, and as much as 50% of England's farmland was already enclosed by 1750. So it wasn't really this huge thing that happened and pushed all of these people out. It had already been happening, and nothing really negative had happened. In 1700, there was a ratio of 2 landless laborers for every self-sufficient farmer, and that number did not become significantly larger by 1750. In the late 17th and early 18th century, lands were enclosed by mutual agreement between all classes of landowners and villages. And so at this time, like, it's going to be used in this kind of movement by Marx and others as the Industrial Revolution takes off, and we see, the definitely differentiation between our wealth in England, but it's, as you look at it now, probably a little more exaggerated, and it wasn't just the enclosure movement that caused all of this. Enclosures, however, did not spread significantly to Eastern Europe. We'll not see really a change in Eastern Europe till later, so keep that in mind, always a little bit behind. France did not develop enclosure as national policy, and after the 1760s, peasants in the provinces strongly opposed enclosure, and Europe won't see any fundamental agricultural changes until the 19th century, so kind of keep them on our back burner until then. But results, impacts of the agricultural revolution. AP Euro loves results. So it led to Europe's population explosion in the 18th century, which is our next topic, if you'll see below here in your note packet. The enclosure movement altered society in the countryside. Common lands were enclosed, thus changing traditional village life. Widespread migration to cities resulted in urbanization, which is going to be very important to us coming up on the Industrial Revolution. And women were adversely affected. AP Euro loves to talk about women, so if you got this as an FRQ prompt, you definitely want to know the impacts it had on women. The cottage industry is going to emerge as a means of supplementing a farm family's income. Cottage industry will equal Industrial Revolution, so very important stepping stone. And economically, the increased supply of food resulted in lower food prices that enable people to spend more money on consumer goods. And this will become very important as we start to build up product in our Industrial Revolution. So, population explosion. So as we've discussed, there were limits on population growth prior to 1700. We've seen famine, we've seen disease, we've seen warfare that kept population growth in check. It's not until the mid-16th century that Europe's population will even reach pre-Black Death levels of the early 1300s. So, what are the cause now of this drastic population explosion? Why is this going to happen? There are reasons that you need to know, and there are some reasons that you probably fundamentally hold in your head that we need to get rid of because they are not correct. So why? Number one, agricultural revolution made more food available to larger populations. More food equals more people. New foods such as the potato from the Columbian Exchange become a staple or main crop for the poor in many countries. Example being Ireland. We'll talk about a negative to that coming up second semester. Improved food transportation due to better roads and canals is going to cause a population explosion. Why? You can take food to areas that have shortages quickly, easily, inexpensively. If this village over here is having a hard time with production, you can ship food to them, keep people alive. Better diet is going to result in stronger immune systems and people's ability to fight disease, and also coming to the end of our little ice age here. You have more food, you have less people that are malnourished, and less people who are going to catch illness, spread illness, etc. Disappearance of the bubonic plague after 1720. We'll also see that with the drainage of water off of lands that there will be less mosquitoes, so less mosquito-borne illnesses. Along with that comes improved sanitation in towns and cities. 18th century wars are going to be less destructive on civilian populations than our 17th, 16th century wars. But something that students generally hold and always answer wrong on a multiple choice question is that advances in medicine were a significant cause. Advances in medicine were not a significant cause. Put a big circle highlight around not. Not yet. We haven't seen significant advances to medicine yet. It is not a cause for population explosion. We have more people being born. We have some people living a little bit longer just because of agriculture, but not because of medical advances. Not yet. Population growth is going to reach a plateau between 1650 and 1750, but will begin to grow dramatically after 1750. So you need to keep that year 1750 in mind when it comes to population. Between 1700 and 1800, the European population will increase from about 120 million to about 190 million people in all of Europe. So that gets us through the agricultural revolution and some review. The agricultural revolution is going to lead us to proto-industrialization, the cottage industry, or the putting out system. It really goes by 3 names, and so that's our next topic here.